A philosopher in ancient Alexandria talked so many people into killing themselves that the king banned him from teaching. Not metaphorically, not exaggerating. Actual bodies, actual suicides, actual royal decree. His name was Hegesias of Cyrene, and he earned the nickname Thanatos, the death persuader. This is his story. We know almost nothing about Hegesias personally. No birth date survives, no death date either. No descriptions of what he looked like, or how he spoke, or whether he had a family. What we have instead is worse, a philosophical position so dark it needed to be suppressed, a book so convincing it became a public safety crisis, and a reputation that echoes across 23 centuries as a warning about where certain ideas can lead. He flourished around 290 BCE in Alexandria, Egypt. That much we can establish. The rest requires detective work through fragmentary ancient sources, most of them hostile, written by people who found his conclusions horrifying. Cicero mentions him. Diogenes Laertius preserves a few details. Beyond that, we're reconstructing a worldview from echoes and condemnations, trying to understand how a philosopher working within a tradition dedicated to pleasure ended up arguing that death might be preferable to life. The Cyrenaic school wasn't supposed to produce pessimists. When Aristippus of Cyrene, one of Socrates' direct students, founded the tradition around 400 BCE, he was advocating for something radical, but not gloomy. Pleasure is the only good. Pain is the only evil. The goal of life is to experience as much pleasure as possible, particularly physical, immediate, intense pleasure. Not the contemplative tranquility the Epicureans would later promote. Not the austere virtue the Stoics demanded, actual enjoyment, sensual, momentary, undeniable. Cyrene itself was a Greek colony in North Africa, in what's now Libya, far from Athens, far from the traditional centres of philosophical debate. This geographic isolation mattered. Distance from the mainland allowed for intellectual independence, for ideas that might have been shut down faster in the academies and lyceum of the Greek heartland. The Cyrenaics could experiment, could push Socratic teachings in directions that would have seemed scandalous in Athens. Aristippus took one piece of Socratic thought and ran with it. Socrates had acknowledged that virtue might have utilitarian value, that it could lead to better outcomes, including pleasure. Aristippus seized on that admission and inverted the priority structure entirely. Forget virtue as the goal, pleasure is the goal. Virtue, if it has any value at all, is merely instrumental, useful only insofar as it produces pleasure. This was philosophical heresy by the standards of most Greek thinkers, who considered virtue intrinsically valuable regardless of its consequences. The epistemology behind Cyrenaic ethics was equally radical. They developed a skeptical theory of knowledge that would have profound implications for everything that followed. We can know our own experiences with certainty. Right now, I'm experiencing sweetness. That's indubitable. I have immediate access to my own sensations, but I cannot know anything about the external objects that cause these sensations. I taste sweetness, but I can't know what honey actually is in itself. I see grey, but I can't know the true nature of the computer screen. The experience reveals nothing beyond itself. This creates a philosophical trap. If all I can truly know is my own subjective experience, and if pleasure and pain are the only goods and evils, then my entire ethical universe collapses inward to immediate sensation. What matters isn't the external world, which I can't truly access. What matters is how things feel to me, right now, in this moment. Everything else is speculation. 4 generations after Aristippus, this is where Hegesias entered the picture. The philosophical lineage runs from Aristippus to his grandson, also named Aristippus, to Antipater of Cyrene, to Epitimides, to Paribates, to Hegesias. Each generation passed down the core commitments, but also reinterpreted them, adjusted them, found new implications in the original insights. By the time the tradition reached Hegesias, something had shifted fundamentally. He had a fellow student named Hegesias who took Cyrenaic thought in a completely different direction. Aniceris softened the school's harsher implications. He argued that friendship, community, and patriotism could provide genuine pleasure and were worth pursuing for their own sake. Relationships mattered. Social bonds had value beyond mere utility. This was a move back toward conventional Greek values, an attempt to reconcile Cyrenaic hedonism with the mainstream belief that humans are social creatures who flourish through connection. Hegesias went the opposite direction. He looked at the same philosophical foundations and concluded that everything Aristippus had hoped for was impossible. The pursuit of positive pleasure was futile. The best we could hope for was the avoidance of pain, and even that was probably beyond our reach. His argument started with the body. Physical existence guarantees suffering. The body experiences pain, discomfort, hunger, thirst, exhaustion, disease, injury, aging. These aren't occasional interruptions to an otherwise pleasant existence. They're constant features of embodied life. You can't escape them by being virtuous or wise or wealthy. They come with having a body at all. The mind can't detach itself from bodily suffering. This was crucial to Hegesias' position. Earlier Cyrenaics had focused on maximizing pleasant sensations, as if the mind could simply focus on pleasure and ignore pain. Hegesias argued that the mind necessarily sympathizes with the body. When the body hurts, the mind is troubled. When the body is ill, mental peace becomes impossible. There's no dualistic escape where consciousness floats free from physical distress. We're unified beings, and that unity means suffering in one domain infects the other. Then there's fortune. Even if you somehow manage to minimize bodily pain and maintain mental equilibrium, chance would destroy your efforts. Fortune prevents many things we cherished in anticipation. You plan for pleasure, work toward it, arrange circumstances to achieve it, and then something unexpected happens. An accident, a betrayal, a natural disaster, political upheaval, disease, the death of someone you love. The variables are infinite and uncontrollable. You can't insulate yourself against fortune's whims through wisdom or preparation. The world is too complex, too interconnected, too unpredictable. These three factors, bodily suffering, the mind's necessary sympathy with bodily pain, and fortune's ability to frustrate expectations, formed the core of Hegesias' pessimism. Together, they made happiness impossible. Not difficult, not rare, impossible. Complete happiness cannot possibly exist. Perfect fulfillment eludes our grasp, not because we're doing something wrong or failing to achieve the right conditions, but because the conditions themselves are contradictory. The nature of embodied existence in an unpredictable world guarantees that suffering will dominate. From this foundation, Hegesias systematically demolished every conventional source of meaning and value. Wealth? Irrelevant. The pleasure of the rich is no different from that of the poor. Both experience the same bodily pains. Both face fortune's unpredictability. The wealthy person might have more comfortable surroundings, but comfort doesn't eliminate suffering. It just changes the details. Poverty brings deprivation and humiliation, but wealth brings anxiety about loss, the burden of management, the dangers of attracting envy and theft. Different problems, same fundamental misery. Slavery versus freedom? Also irrelevant. Pleasure does not depend on whether someone is slave or free, noble or not, famous or insignificant. This was a shocking claim in a society built on slavery, where freedom was considered essential to human flourishing. Hegesias argued that the slave and the free person both suffer. The slave has obvious constraints, but the free person has responsibilities, anxieties, and the weight of decision-making. Neither condition provides escape from the human predicament. Friendship received even harsher treatment. There is no gratitude, friendship, or benevolence because we choose them not for what they are, but because we need them. If there is no such need, they are lost too. This struck at the heart of Greek ethics, which considered philia, friendship, one of life's essential goods. Hegesias reduced it to pure utility. You cultivate friendships because they're useful, because they meet needs. The moment those needs disappear, the relationship dissolves. There's no intrinsic value in connection, no genuine care for another person. Everything is transactional, instrumental, ultimately hollow. The wise person, the sage who has achieved philosophical understanding, recognizes this. The wise does what he does for himself, because he considers no one else his equal. This isn't arrogance, it's clear-eyed assessment. Others can't solve your suffering. They can't provide genuine consolation. They're trapped in the same predicament you are. The sage achieves radical self-sufficiency not through transcendence, but through acceptance of isolation. And this is where Hegesias arrived at his most disturbing conclusion. If happiness is impossible, if life consists primarily of unavoidable suffering, if external circumstances provide no relief, and if other people offer no genuine comfort, then what reason is there to prefer existence to non-existence? Both life and death are desirable, or more accurately, both are matters of indifference. The sage ought to regard nothing but himself. Action is quite indifferent. And if action is indifferent, so also is life, which therefore is in no way more desirable than death. This wasn't a call for universal suicide, at least not exactly. Modern scholars have pointed out that Hegesias distinguished between the wise and the foolish. For fools, people who haven't achieved philosophical understanding, life has advantages. They're still capable of experiencing fleeting pleasures, still susceptible to hope and anticipation. For the sage, someone who has seen through these illusions, life is indifferent, neither worth pursuing nor worth fleeing. A matter of complete neutrality. But neutrality between life and death is disturbing enough. It removes the fundamental preference for continued existence that most ethical systems take as given. If living and dying are equivalent in value, then the question of whether to continue living becomes arbitrary, a matter of whim rather than reason. And if that's the case, why endure suffering when cessation is available? Hegesias wrote a book exploring these implications. The Greek title was Apokartieron, usually translated as Death by Starvation or The Man Who Starves Himself. According to Cicero, who wrote about it centuries later, the book took the form of a dialogue. A man has resolved to end his life by refusing food. His wife and children confront him, pleading with him to reconsider. Instead of being persuaded, he catalogues life's miseries in systematic detail, demonstrating that death offers relief from suffering. We don't have the original text, it's lost, like most ancient philosophical works. What survives are descriptions and fragments preserved by later writers, usually people horrified by its conclusions. But we can reconstruct the general structure. The protagonist apparently addressed every major human condition: poverty, wealth, power, slavery, freedom, and showed how each brought its own forms of suffering. There was no escape clause, no circumstance that would make happiness possible. Every path led to misery. The book's impact was unprecedented. Cicero reports that the gloomy descriptions of human misery were so overpowering that they inspired many people to kill themselves. This wasn't metaphor or exaggeration. Ancient sources are clear that actual suicides resulted from reading or hearing Hegesias' arguments. The philosophical position had demonstrable, fatal consequences. Alexandria, where Hegesias was teaching around 290 BCE, was one of the ancient world's great intellectual centres. Founded by Alexander the Great and developed by the Ptolemaic dynasty, it housed the famous Library of Alexandria and the museum, attracting scholars from throughout the Mediterranean. The educated Alexandrian audience was sophisticated, well-versed in various philosophical schools, capable of engaging with complex arguments. Their susceptibility to Hegesias' message suggests his reasoning touched genuine anxieties present in Hellenistic society. Ptolemy, The second Philadelphus, the king ruling Alexandria during this period, decided he'd seen enough. According to ancient sources, he banned Hegesias from teaching anywhere in the city. This represents one of the earliest recorded instances of philosophical censorship. A monarch known as a patron of learning drew a definite line. Philosophy that actively encouraged suicide crossed from academic discourse into public safety crisis. The banishment didn't erase Hegesias' influence. His nickname, Thanatos, the death persuader, stuck. It became shorthand for a particular kind of pessimism, a warning about where certain philosophical premises could lead. But the story raises uncomfortable questions that extend far beyond one banned teacher in ancient Alexandria. What happens when philosophy becomes dangerous enough to ban? Not because it challenges political power or religious orthodoxy, but because it convinces people to stop existing? The answer lies in understanding exactly what Hegesias argued. His reasoning wasn't mystical or emotional. It was methodical, building from premises his audience already accepted. Start with the body. Every human experiences physical sensations constantly. Hunger, fatigue, temperature discomfort, minor pains that accumulate throughout each day. The body is never entirely comfortable. You're always too hot or too cold, too full or too hungry, restless or lethargic. Complete physical ease is a moment, not a state. And those moments are brief. Hegesias inherited this observation from earlier Cyrenaic philosophy. Aristippus and his followers had taught that only immediate sensations could be known with certainty. You can't be wrong about whether you're experiencing pain right now. That experience is self-evident, unmediated, direct. But this epistemological starting point led Hegesias to a darker conclusion. If sensations are all we know reliably, and sensations are predominantly uncomfortable, then our most certain knowledge is of our own suffering. The mind doesn't escape this. Here's where Hegesias made a crucial move. The mind isn't separate from the body in some dualistic sense. It's affected by bodily states, sympathetically troubled when the body's troubled. Your thoughts depend on physical conditions. Try concentrating while hungry. Try remaining calm while in pain. The mental and physical aren't independent realms. They're intertwined, and that means mental suffering is inevitable, because physical suffering is inevitable. But there's a third factor, more insidious than either. Fortune, the unpredictable element of chance that governs external circumstances. You can't control fortune, that's definitional. Events happen that you didn't cause and couldn't prevent. Someone you love dies suddenly. An investment fails. A fire destroys your property. An accident leaves you injured. These aren't failures of planning or wisdom. They're the fundamental randomness of existence asserting itself. Hegesias argued that fortune doesn't just occasionally disrupt our plans. It systematically prevents the fulfillment of our expectations. We anticipate pleasure, and circumstances intervene. We build toward goals, and external events knock them down. The gap between expectation and reality is where much of human suffering occurs. And since we can't eliminate fortune, we can't eliminate this gap. These three factors, bodily discomfort, mental distress, and fortune's interference, form an iron triangle. Each one alone would be problematic. Together, they make happiness impossible. Notice what Hegesias isn't claiming. He's not saying life contains no pleasant moments. Even he would admit that momentary pleasures exist. What he's denying is the possibility of eudaimonia, the sustained happiness or flourishing that Greek philosophy generally took as life's goal. Individual pleasant sensations don't add up to a happy life. They're separated by longer stretches of neutral or negative experience, and they're always vulnerable to being obliterated by suffering. This leads to a radical conclusion about conventional values. If happiness is impossible, regardless of circumstances, then circumstances themselves become irrelevant to what matters. Consider wealth. Most people assume being wealthy is better than being poor. The wealthy have more resources, more options, more security. But Hegesias question this. Does wealth actually produce more pleasure than poverty? The rich person worries about losing wealth, managing it, protecting it from theft or fraud or bad investments. They face social complications, determining who's genuine and who's interested only in their money. They experience the psychological burden of abundance, the paralysis of too many choices. Wealth brings its own anxieties. Meanwhile, poverty has advantages the wealthy don't experience. The poor person has fewer possessions to worry about losing. Their social relationships are more likely to be genuine rather than transactional. They potentially have clearer goals, since survival demands focus. The relief of satisfying basic needs might be more intense precisely because those needs are more pressing. Hegesias wasn't romanticizing poverty. He was arguing that both wealth and poverty involve distinct forms of suffering and distinct forms of relief. They're different, not better or worse. The net amount of pleasure versus pain balances out regardless of which condition you're in. The same logic applies to freedom versus slavery. Freedom sounds obviously preferable, but freedom brings responsibility, anxiety about making wrong choices, the burden of self-determination. The free person must constantly decide what to do, knowing they'll bear the consequences. They face infinite options and no clear path. That's its own form of suffering. Slavery removes these burdens. Decisions are made by others. Responsibility isn't yours. There's a kind of relief in having no choices. Obviously, slavery involves different suffering, loss of autonomy, subjugation, potential physical abuse. Hegesias' point isn't that these balance out morally, it's that they balance out hedonistically. The total quantity of pleasure versus pain experienced by slave and free person isn't significantly different. This is disturbing precisely because it seems partially true. We've all experienced moments where having fewer choices felt like relief rather than deprivation, where having someone else make decisions removed anxiety rather than causing it. Hegesias took that observation and universalized it into a complete moral system. Power suffers the same analysis. The powerful person constantly fears losing power, faces threats from rivals, must maintain authority through vigilance and sometimes violence. Power requires perpetual performance, never showing weakness, never relaxing. The psychological cost is enormous. The powerless person doesn't face these specific anxieties. They're not responsible for others. They're not targets for rivals. They can relax in their lack of authority. Different circumstances, similar net suffering. By systematically dismantling the value of every conventionally desirable condition, Hegesias left no escape. There's no circumstance that guarantees happiness, no status, no amount of wealth, no degree of freedom or power that makes life fundamentally better. All paths lead to equivalent suffering, but he went further. He attacked not just circumstances, but relationships. Greek culture valued friendship, philia, as one of life's essential goods. Aristotle would write extensively about friendship's importance. It wasn't optional or secondary. It was fundamental to human flourishing. Hegesias rejected this entirely. Friendship isn't valued for itself. It's instrumental. We pursue friendships because we need things from other people: practical help, emotional support, social connections. If those needs disappeared, so would friendship. Nobody seeks friendship with someone who offers nothing useful. That's definitional. This means friendship is inherently selfish and transactional. You befriend people who benefit you. You maintain relationships as long as they're useful. When usefulness ends, the friendship dissolves. There's no inherent value in the relationship itself, only in what it provides. The same applies to gratitude and benevolence. These aren't genuine moral sentiments. They're social mechanisms that facilitate exchange. I'm grateful because I might need your help again. I'm benevolent because it builds social capital. Remove the instrumental value, and these sentiments evaporate. For the sage, the wise person who sees through these illusions, other people become nearly irrelevant. The sage does what he does for himself alone, considering no one else is equal. This isn't misanthropy exactly, it's radical self-sufficiency, recognition that others can't provide genuine consolation for existence's fundamental misery. This philosophical position has an internal logic that's hard to refute on its own terms. If you accept the premises, the conclusion follows. That's what made it dangerous. The book Death by Starvation apparently structured this argument as a dialogue. The protagonist, having decided to starve himself, faces his wife and children. They plead with him to reconsider. What follows isn't an emotional breakdown or mystical revelation. It's systematic philosophical argument. He addresses poverty, describes its humiliations and deprivations, then addresses wealth, catalogues its anxieties and burdens, power's stresses, slavery's degradations, freedom's responsibilities. Each life circumstance gets examined and found wanting. There's no refuge, no circumstance that makes continued existence worthwhile. The dialogue format is crucial. Ancient philosophical dialogues typically featured a wise teacher correcting a student's errors, leading them toward truth. Plato's dialogues follow this pattern. Socrates questions, the interlocutor realizes their confusion, truth emerges. Hegesias inverted this. His protagonist faces people who think they understand life's value. They offer conventional wisdom, family bonds, duty, hope. And he systematically demolishes every argument. The dialogue doesn't lead toward life affirmation, it leads toward death acceptance. What made this so effective? Probably the comprehensiveness. The protagonist doesn't ignore counter-arguments. He addresses them directly, acknowledging what seems valuable about life, then explaining why those apparent values don't hold up under scrutiny. This creates the impression of intellectual honesty, of someone who's genuinely grappled with the question and arrived at an uncomfortable truth rather than someone promoting a predetermined conclusion. The ancient testimonies emphasize the work's emotional power. The descriptions of human misery were overpowering. This wasn't dry philosophical analysis. It was vivid, affecting, designed to make you feel the weight of suffering rather than just understand it intellectually. And people responded, not just by disagreeing or being disturbed, by acting. Ancient sources are consistent that actual suicides resulted from exposure to Hegesias' arguments. This wasn't rumour or exaggeration for rhetorical effect. Multiple independent sources report the same phenomenon. How many people? We don't know exact numbers. The sources say many, which is vague but suggests more than isolated incidents. Enough that it became noticeable, enough that authorities felt compelled to respond. Ptolemy II Philadelphus ruled Egypt from 285 to 246 BCE. His reign was generally characterized by cultural patronage. He expanded the Library of Alexandria, supported scholars and poets, promoted intellectual life. He wasn't a tyrant suppressing dissent. He was a Hellenistic monarch who understood that cultural prestige brought political legitimacy. But he banned Hegesias, not from the kingdom entirely, just from teaching. The philosopher could remain in Alexandria, but couldn't lecture publicly, couldn't address audiences, couldn't spread his arguments through the institutional channels of philosophical education. This represents a fascinating line-drawing exercise. Philosophy that challenged religious beliefs was acceptable. Philosophy that criticized political systems was tolerated within limits. But philosophy that convinced people to stop living crossed a boundary. Why? The obvious answer is public safety. Dead citizens don't pay taxes, serve in armies, or contribute to society. From a ruler's perspective, philosophy that produces corpses is a practical problem regardless of its theoretical merits. But there's something deeper, Suicide resulting from philosophical conviction challenges the entire social order in a way that political or religious dissent doesn't. It suggests that reasoned argument can override the most fundamental human drive, self-preservation. If philosophy can convince people that life itself isn't worth continuing, what else might it convince them of? What other foundational assumptions might crumble? The banishment didn't silence Hegesias entirely. The nickname Pisithenatos, death persuader, spread. It became shorthand for a particular philosophical position, a warning about where certain premises lead. Later philosophers referenced him, usually negatively, as an example of hedonism gone wrong, but the questions he raised didn't disappear. They're still with us actually, though we don't often acknowledge their source. The philosophical underpinnings of Hegesias's position deserve closer examination because they reveal how he arrived at conclusions that seem so extreme to his contemporaries. Start with the Cyrenaic theory of knowledge. This wasn't just an abstract epistemological exercise, it had direct ethical consequences. The Cyrenaics believed we can know our own immediate experiences with certainty. You're having a sweet sensation right now. That's knowable. But the external object causing that sensation, the honey itself, its true nature, whether it's objectively sweet or just appears sweet to you, unknowable. We're trapped inside our own subjective experiences, unable to access the world as it actually is. This creates a profound isolation. You can't truly know what another person experiences. When you both taste honey, you might call it sweet, but you're each describing your own private sensation. Whether those sensations are similar, whether they're the same, you'll never know. Communication becomes a game of shared labels attached to fundamentally inaccessible private experiences. From this epistemology, the Cyrenaics drew a radical conclusion. If we can only know our own experiences, and if pleasure is what we seek, then the only pleasure that matters is the one you're experiencing right now. Not anticipated pleasure, because you can't know if it'll actually arrive. Not remembered pleasure, because memory is just another present experience, not the original sensation. Just this moment's feeling. Aristippus, the school's founder, took this as liberating. Live for the present. Master your desires rather than being enslaved by them. Enjoy what's available now without anxiety about tomorrow. It was hedonism, certainly, but hedonism with a kind of joyful immediacy. Hegesias inherited this framework, but reached darker conclusions. If only present experience matters, and if present experience is overwhelmingly characterized by discomfort, frustration, and pain, then what? The body constantly generates unpleasant sensations. Hunger, thirst, fatigue, illness. You can satisfy one need, but another immediately appears. The satisfaction itself is brief, often less intense than the preceding discomfort. The mind can't detach itself from bodily suffering. This was Hegesias's second key premise. Dualistic philosophers like Plato argued that the soul could transcend bodily concerns through reason and contemplation. Hegesias rejected this. When your body hurts, your mind hurts. They're not separate domains where one can remain serene while the other suffers. They're bound together, and the body's vulnerability makes the mind vulnerable too. Then there's fortune, touche in Greek, that unpredictable force that shapes events beyond our control. You can plan, work, build, and fortune can destroy it all in a moment. Illness, accident, war, betrayal. The things you anticipate with pleasure often fail to materialize. The things you dread arrive unexpectedly. And even when you achieve what you wanted, the achievement rarely brings the satisfaction you imagined. These three elements, bodily suffering, mental distress sympathetic to the body, and fortune's frustration of expectations, formed the core of Hegesias's argument for why happiness is impossible. Not difficult to achieve, not rare, impossible. The very structure of embodied existence in an unpredictable world makes sustained positive experience unattainable. This led him to reject virtually all conventional values. Wealth? The rich person experiences pleasure no differently than the poor person. Both are subject to bodily needs and fortune's whims. Wealth might provide more means to pursue satisfaction, but satisfaction itself remains elusive. And wealth brings its own anxieties about loss, management, the envy of others, the burden of responsibility. Poverty, obviously unpleasant in its deprivations, but not fundamentally worse than wealth in terms of achieving happiness, because happiness isn't achievable either way. The poor person isn't missing out on some profound well-being that the wealthy enjoy. Both are trapped in the same condition of unsatisfied striving. Freedom and slavery. This was particularly radical in Greek culture, where freedom was celebrated as a supreme good. Hegesias argued they're indifferent. The slave lacks autonomy, but also lacks certain responsibilities and anxieties. The free person has choice, but also faces the burden of decisions, the possibility of making wrong choices, the stress of self-determination. Neither condition provides access to genuine happiness. Fame and obscurity? Same analysis. The famous person gains recognition but loses privacy, faces envy and criticism, must constantly maintain their reputation. The obscure person avoids these stresses, but might feel their life lacks significance. Neither achieves the satisfaction they seek. Every conventional goal, every status people normally pursue, Hegesias subjected to this levelling analysis. And the conclusion was always the same. These things don't deliver what they promise. They're indifferent to the actual achievement of well-being. What about relationships? This is where Hegesias' philosophy becomes especially stark and where he departs most dramatically from mainstream Greek values. Friendship, philia, was considered one of life's essential goods by virtually every Greek philosophical school. Aristotle devoted 2 books of his ethics to friendship. The Epicureans made friendship central to their vision of the good life. Hegesias rejected it. There is no gratitude, friendship, or benevolence, because we choose them not for what they are, but because we need them. This is pure instrumentalism. You don't value your friends for themselves. You value them for what they provide: security, pleasure, utility. If those needs disappeared, the friendship would disappear too. This isn't just cynicism, it follows from Cyrenaic premises. If only subjective experience matters, and if you can't access another person's inner life, then other people become external objects, whose value lies entirely in how they affect your experiences. A friend is someone whose presence generates pleasant sensations. When that stops, what remains? The sage, in Hegesias' view, recognizes this. He does what he does for himself, considering no one else his equal. Not equal in worth, but equal in the sense of being genuinely knowable or truly connected. The sage is radically self-sufficient because he understands that others can't provide genuine consolation for existence's fundamental dissatisfaction. This creates an ethical framework that's almost sociopathic by conventional standards. No genuine care for others, no intrinsic value in relationships, no duty beyond self-interest. Yet Hegesias apparently wasn't advocating cruelty or exploitation. The sage wouldn't harm others unnecessarily, not out of compassion, but because doing so serves no purpose and might bring unwanted consequences. It's ethics stripped of sentiment, reduced to cold calculation about what minimizes displeasure. The final logical step was inevitable. If happiness is impossible, if all conventional values are indifferent, if relationships lack intrinsic worth, then what reason remains to continue living? Life and death are desirable. Actually, that's a misleading translation. Better to say they're both indifferent, neither preferable to the other. Life doesn't offer goods that make it worth choosing over non-existence. Death doesn't represent a loss of valuable experiences, because those experiences aren't genuinely valuable anyway. For the sage who understands this, action itself becomes indifferent. Why do anything? Why pursue goals, maintain relationships, participate in society? These activities don't lead to happiness. They're just ways of passing time until death arrives naturally. And if action is indifferent, then life itself is indifferent. There's no inherent reason to prefer continued existence to its cessation. This is where Hegesias' philosophy reaches its most uncomfortable conclusion. He's not exactly advocating suicide. The wise person doesn't actively choose death because that would require valuing it over life, which contradicts the indifference he's established. But the wise person also has no reason to resist death. If life and death are equivalent in value, then someone who decides to stop eating, to let themselves die through passive means, isn't making an irrational choice. They're simply exercising their indifference in one direction rather than another. The dialogue, Death by Starvation, apparently illustrated this logic through dramatic confrontation. The protagonist has chosen to die. His family and friends present every reason to live: duty to loved ones, future possibilities, the sweetness of life's pleasures, the horror of death. And he systematically refutes each argument, not through abstract logic, but through vivid description of life's actual character. The comprehensiveness matters. He doesn't just address one or two objections, he tackles them all. Every reason someone might give for continuing to live, he has a response. This creates the impression not of someone rationalizing a predetermined conclusion, but of someone who's genuinely examined the question and found every answer wanting. And the emotional power. Ancient sources emphasize this repeatedly. The descriptions of human misery were overpowering. This wasn't dry philosophical analysis. It was affecting, designed to make readers feel the weight of suffering rather than just understand it intellectually. You are meant to recognize your own experience in these descriptions, to see your own disappointments and frustrations reflected back. The combination of intellectual comprehensiveness and emotional resonance made the work dangerous. Readers didn't just disagree or feel disturbed, they acted. Multiple ancient sources report actual suicides resulting from exposure to Hegesias' arguments. Not rumours, not rhetorical exaggeration, multiple independent sources confirm the same phenomenon. How did ancient audiences respond more broadly? Beyond the suicides, which represented an extreme reaction, the work must have generated intense discussion. Philosophical texts that propose radical conclusions always do. But this one had immediate practical stakes. It wasn't just challenging abstract beliefs about metaphysics or epistemology. It was challenging the most fundamental commitment, the commitment to continued existence. Some readers probably found it liberating. If life and death are truly indifferent, then perhaps the anxiety about mortality that haunts human existence becomes unnecessary. You don't need to fear death if it's no worse than life. This could produce a kind of serenity, though a dark one. Others likely found it deeply disturbing, precisely because they couldn't refute it effectively. The arguments had a certain logical force. If you accepted Cyrenaic premises about knowledge and pleasure, if you acknowledged the pervasiveness of suffering and fortune's unpredictability, if you recognized how conventional values fail to deliver promised satisfaction, then where exactly was the flaw in Hegesias' reasoning? The philosophical responses came from various schools. The Epicureans offered the most systematic alternative. Epicurus, roughly contemporary with Hegesias, developed a hedonism that explicitly avoided these pessimistic conclusions. He redefined pleasure as the absence of pain rather than positive sensation, making it more achievable. He emphasized mental pleasures and long-term calculation over momentary physical gratifications. He elevated friendship to a supreme good, arguing it provided unique and irreplaceable value, and he developed strategies for managing fear, especially fear of death, that were meant to make life genuinely worth living. The Stoics took a completely different approach. They rejected hedonism entirely, arguing that virtue, not pleasure, was the only true good. External circumstances, including physical pleasure and pain, were genuinely indifferent, but not in Hegesias' sense. They were indifferent because they couldn't affect what really mattered: your moral character and rational agency. The Stoic sage achieved well-being through virtue regardless of fortune, relationships, or bodily experience. Both responses implicitly acknowledged that Hegesias had identified real problems. The Epicurean emphasis on achievable, stable pleasures and the Stoic focus on internal goods, independent of external circumstances, were attempts to provide what Hegesias claimed was impossible: a path to genuine well-being. They wouldn't have needed to develop these sophisticated strategies if the pessimistic critique weren't powerful. But Hegesias himself remained a marginal figure philosophically. His position was too extreme to attract a lasting following. Even within the Cyrenaic school, his fellow students took very different directions. Hegesias, his contemporary, tried to rehabilitate Cyrenaic hedonism by emphasizing the pleasures of friendship, patriotism, and social bonds. Theodorus the atheist went in yet another direction, denying that pleasure and pain were intrinsically good or bad, and focusing instead on mental cheerfulness achieved through wisdom. The Cyrenaic school fractured into these competing factions precisely because the original position contained tensions that different thinkers resolved incompatibly. Is pleasure really the only good? If so, what counts as pleasure? Physical sensation, mental states, relationships? And if we can only know our own experiences, how do we build an ethics that applies to others? These questions didn't have obvious answers, and the three major late Cyrenaics answered them in radically different ways, each claiming to represent the true development of Aristippus' original insights. The school's dissolution by the mid-3rd century BCE wasn't just institutional failure. It reflected genuine philosophical instability at the core of Cyrenaic thought. Hegesias' contribution was pushing that instability to its logical extreme, showing where pure subjective hedonism combined with skeptical epistemology could lead. Not to joyful pleasure-seeking, but to nihilistic indifference. Not to mastery of desire, but to the equation of life and death in value. That fragmentation tells us something crucial about philosophical systems built on subjective experience alone. Without shared standards for evaluating claims or common criteria for truth beyond individual sensation, there's no mechanism for resolving fundamental disagreements. Each philosopher could claim to represent authentic Cyrenaic principles while reaching completely opposite conclusions. Aristippus had created a framework flexible enough to accommodate radically different developments, which meant it was also unstable enough to splinter under pressure. The timing of the school's collapse matters too. By the mid-3rd century BCE, new philosophical movements were offering more compelling alternatives. Epicurus had already established his garden in Athens around 307 BCE, and his refined hedonism was attracting followers who might otherwise have gravitated towards Cyrenaic thought. The Stoic school, founded by Zeno around the same time, provided a completely different answer to questions about how to live well. These weren't just competing philosophies, they were better organized institutions with clear succession plans, systematic doctrines, and growing networks of adherents. The Cyrenaics never developed that kind of institutional structure. They remained loosely connected individuals teaching in various cities, united more by association with Aristippus' memory than by any formal organization. When the three major late Cyrenaics split into incompatible factions, there was no mechanism for adjudicating between them, no authoritative body that could declare one interpretation correct and others heretical. The school simply dissolved into its constituent parts. What survived wasn't Cyrenaic philosophy as a living tradition, but fragments preserved in the writings of rivals and critics. Diogenes Laertius, writing in the 3rd century CE, hundreds of years after the school's dissolution, collected biographical information and philosophical opinions from earlier sources. Much of what we know about Hegesias comes from his brief summaries. Cicero, writing in the 1st century BCE, mentioned Hegesias's banishment from Alexandria as an example of philosophy's potential dangers. These weren't sympathetic interpreters trying to preserve Cyrenaic thought for posterity. They were writers with their own agendas, using Cyrenaic examples to make larger points. This creates significant problems for reconstructing Hegesias's actual views. We have no surviving writings from him directly. The book that earned him the epithet Death Persuader exists only as descriptions in hostile or neutral sources. When Cicero summarizes the arguments in Apocateron, he's working from memory or from summaries, not from the original text. When Diogenes Laertius lists Hegesias's philosophical positions, he's compiling information from multiple sources that may have disagreed with each other. The result is that our picture of Hegesias is necessarily incomplete and possibly distorted. We know he argued that happiness was impossible. We know he claimed life and death were matters of indifference. We know he wrote a dialogue about voluntary starvation. We know his teaching was banned in Alexandria. But the nuances of his position, the specific arguments he used, the qualifications and distinctions he might have made, these are largely lost to us. Consider what we're missing. Did Hegesias actually advocate suicide? Or did he simply argue that life and death were equivalent in value, leaving the choice to individual circumstances? The ancient sources give conflicting signals. Some descriptions suggest active promotion of self-destruction. Others indicate a more subtle position, where death wasn't recommended but simply presented as a rational option under certain conditions. Modern scholars have tried to reconcile these accounts, but the evidence permits multiple interpretations. The question matters because it affects how we understand Hegesias's relationship to the broader Cyrenaic tradition. If he was genuinely advocating universal suicide, that represents a complete break with hedonism. You can't pursue pleasure if you're dead. The position becomes incoherent within a hedonistic framework. But if he was arguing that the wise person recognizes life and death as indifferent while acknowledging that fools might still find advantages in living, that's philosophically more sophisticated. It preserves the Cyrenaic focus on subjective experience while drawing pessimistic conclusions about what that experience typically involves. The Alexandrian context adds another layer of complexity. Why did Hegesias's teaching find particular resonance there? Alexandria, in the early Hellenistic period, was a city of immigrants, displaced persons, and cultural mixing. The old certainties of classical Greek city-states had been shattered by Alexander's conquests and the fragmentation of his empire. People found themselves living in vast cosmopolitan centres, where traditional identities and values no longer provided secure foundations for meaning. This was the world of Hellenistic philosophy more broadly. The questions that obsessed Plato and Aristotle about the best constitution for a city-state or how to cultivate civic virtue seemed increasingly irrelevant. The new philosophical schools, Epicureans, Stoics, Skeptics, focused instead on individual well-being, on how to achieve tranquility and contentment regardless of external political circumstances. They were philosophies of adaptation to a world that felt less controllable and less comprehensible than before. Hegesias's pessimism spoke to that anxiety. If the world is fundamentally unpredictable and uncontrollable, if fortune can overturn any achievement and frustrate any plan, then perhaps the pursuit of happiness really is futile. Perhaps the best one can hope for is minimizing suffering rather than maximizing pleasure. This wasn't an abstract academic position. It was a response to lived experience in a world that must have felt precarious and alienating to many. The comparison to Buddhism that some scholars have drawn is intriguing but probably overstated. There are superficial similarities. Both traditions identify suffering as a fundamental feature of existence. Both question the value of conventional pursuits, like wealth, status, and sensory pleasure. Both suggest that ordinary people are deluded about what will bring satisfaction, but the differences are more significant than the parallels. Buddhism offers a systematic path to liberation from suffering through ethical conduct, mental training, and wisdom development. The Four Noble Truths don't just diagnose the problem, they prescribe a solution. Suffering exists, it has a cause, it can be ended, and here's how to end it. The Eightfold Path provides concrete practices, meditation techniques, ethical guidelines, and philosophical understanding designed to transform consciousness and eliminate the root causes of dukkha. Hegesias offered no such path. His diagnosis was pessimistic, but his prescription was essentially resignation. Accept that happiness is impossible. Recognize that external goods can't deliver satisfaction. Understand that life and death are equivalent in value. Then what? The philosophical endpoint seems to be a kind of grim acceptance, enduring life without hope for genuine improvement, awaiting death without fear, but also without expectation that it will provide anything positive. The Buddhist Cyrenaic connection, if it existed at all, probably came through intermediaries rather than direct contact. Alexander's conquests had opened routes between the Mediterranean and India. Greek kingdoms were established in Bactria and beyond. Buddhist missionaries were active during this period. Ashoka's inscriptions mention sending Dharma envoys to Greek rulers, so cultural exchange was certainly possible. But philosophical influence requires more than casual contact. It requires sustained engagement with texts, translations, extended discussions. There's no evidence that Greek philosophers in this period had access to Buddhist scriptures or detailed knowledge of Buddhist doctrine. What they might have encountered were travelers' reports, second-hand descriptions, garbled summaries. These could have sparked interest in certain themes: suffering, the critique of desire, the question of life's value, without transmitting the systematic framework that makes Buddhist philosophy coherent. It's more likely that Hegesias reached his conclusions independently, following the internal logic of Cyrenaic principles to their pessimistic endpoint. The epistemological skepticism that said we can only know our own sensations, the hedonistic ethics that made pleasure the sole good, the empirical observation that pleasure is fleeting and often mixed with pain, these premises pointed toward pessimism without requiring any Buddhist influence. Multiple philosophical traditions can arrive at similar conclusions through different routes. What makes Hegesias interesting isn't whether he was influenced by Buddhism. It's that he represents an extreme possibility latent within Greek philosophy itself. The pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles had already written about the soul's entrapment in bodily existence as a kind of punishment. The tragic poets had explored themes of suffering, futility, and the precariousness of human happiness. Solon's famous dictum to call no man happy until he's dead expressed a recognition that fortune could overturn any life at any moment. Hegesias took these darker strands of Greek thought and wove them into a systematic philosophical position. He wasn't importing foreign pessimism, he was developing indigenous Greek insights about the human condition to their logical conclusion. The fact that his conclusion seemed so extreme to his contemporaries that he was banned from teaching tells us something about the limits of acceptable philosophical speculation in the Hellenistic world. Those limits were different from what they'd been in classical Athens. Socrates was executed for impiety and corrupting youth, but the charges against him were religious and political as much as philosophical. Plato and Aristotle taught freely, even when their views contradicted popular opinion. The philosophical schools of Hellenistic Athens operated openly, attracting students from across the Greek world. Philosophy was generally protected as a legitimate intellectual activity. Hegesias's banishment represents something different. It wasn't about religious heterodoxy or political subversion. It was about the practical consequences of philosophical teaching. Ptolemy II Philadelphus didn't object to Hegesias's conclusions on intellectual grounds. He objected because people were acting on them. When philosophy moves from abstract speculation to concrete influence on behavior, especially behavior that threatens social order, it becomes a political problem. This raises questions about philosophy's purpose and limits. Should philosophers be free to pursue arguments wherever they lead, regardless of consequences? Or do they have ethical responsibilities to consider the effects of their teaching? If your philosophy convinces people to kill themselves, does that prove something is wrong with the philosophy? Or does it simply demonstrate that most people can't handle difficult truths? The ancient world didn't have clear answers to these questions. Different schools took different positions. The Epicureans maintained that philosophy should provide practical guidance for living well. If a philosophical position made life worse rather than better, that was evidence against it. The Stoics argued that philosophy revealed truth about reality and human nature. If people misunderstood or misapplied those truths, the fault lay with the students, not the philosophy. Hegesias seems to have believed he was simply following arguments to their logical conclusions. If pleasure is the only good, if pleasure is rarely achieved and never sustained, if external circumstances can't be controlled, then what follows? The answer he reached was that happiness, understood as a stable state of well-being, is impossible. Life consists of managing pain and disappointment, with occasional fleeting pleasures that provide temporary relief but no lasting satisfaction. That conclusion might be true. It might accurately describe the human condition for most people in most circumstances. But truth alone doesn't determine whether a philosophy is beneficial. A philosophy can be true and harmful simultaneously. It can accurately diagnose problems while offering no constructive response. It can strip away illusions that, whatever their relationship to reality, serve important psychological functions. This is what Hegesias's critics, both ancient and modern, have essentially argued. Yes, life contains suffering. Yes, pleasure is fleeting. Yes, fortune is unpredictable. But emphasizing these facts to the exclusion of everything else produces a distorted picture that makes existence seem worse than it actually is. It's a kind of philosophical depression, focusing selectively on negative aspects while ignoring or minimizing positive ones. The counter-argument would be that Hegesias was simply being honest about realities that other philosophers tried to obscure with comforting fictions. The Epicurean claim that simple pleasures can provide stable satisfaction, the Stoic insistence that virtue alone suffices for happiness. These might be noble lies designed to make life bearable rather than accurate descriptions of human possibility. If so, Hegesias's crime was excessive honesty, refusing to participate in the collective delusion that makes social existence possible. We can't resolve this debate because we can't step outside human perspective to evaluate whether life is objectively worth living. We're embedded in existence, making judgments about existence from within it. Some people find life satisfying despite its difficulties. Others experience it as fundamentally unsatisfying despite moments of pleasure. Neither group can prove the other wrong through pure arguments because the dispute isn't really about logic. It's about fundamental orientation toward experience. What we can say is that Hegesias represented a possibility that Greek philosophy explored and ultimately rejected. The pessimistic conclusion was available, derivable from premises that many philosophers shared, but the Greek philosophical tradition, as a whole, moved in different directions. The schools that survived and flourished were those offering strategies for living well, not those arguing that living well was impossible. Ptolemy's decision to banish Hegesias wasn't made lightly. Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE was perhaps the most intellectually vibrant city in the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls. The museum attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean. Philosophers, mathematicians, astronomers, physicians all gathered there under royal patronage. Ptolemy II Philadelphus prided himself on supporting learning. He collected books obsessively. He commissioned translations. He funded research. This was a ruler who understood knowledge's value, yet he drew a line at Hegesias. When reports reached the palace that people were killing themselves after attending philosophical lectures, Ptolemy acted decisively. He didn't just ask Hegesias to tone down his rhetoric. He expelled him from the city entirely and forbade him from teaching anywhere in the kingdom. This represents one of the earliest documented cases of philosophical censorship in Western history. The precedent is significant. A government decided that certain ideas were too dangerous to be publicly taught, regardless of their logical validity. The reasoning behind this censorship reveals tensions between philosophy and politics that persist today. Philosophy claims to pursue truth wherever arguments lead. Political authority maintains social order and protects citizens' well-being. Sometimes these goals conflict. If philosophical conclusions undermine the will to live, if they make existence seem pointless, should they be suppressed? Ptolemy apparently believed yes. The state has legitimate interest in preventing mass suicide. Ideas that directly cause deaths fall outside acceptable discourse. But this position raises immediate problems. Who decides which ideas are too dangerous? On what basis? If Hegesias' pessimism deserved censorship, what about other challenging philosophies? The cynics preached contempt for conventional values. Should they be silenced? The skeptics questioned whether anything could be known with certainty. Was that corrosive to social order? Once you establish the principle that dangerous ideas should be suppressed, where do you draw boundaries? The ancient world never resolved these questions satisfactorily. Different rulers took different approaches. Some, like Ptolemy, intervened when philosophy seemed to threaten public safety. Others maintained hands-off policies allowing philosophers complete freedom. The tension remained unresolved because both positions have merit. Truth matters, social stability matters. When they conflict, there's no neutral ground for arbitration. What's particularly interesting about Hegesias' case is that the danger wasn't incitement to violence against others. He wasn't advocating revolution or assassination. The threat was entirely self-directed. People were harming themselves based on philosophical arguments they found convincing. This makes the censorship harder to justify by modern standards. We generally believe adults should be free to make their own decisions about existence, even if we disagree with those decisions. Interfering with that autonomy requires extraordinary justification. Yet Ptolemy's concern wasn't unreasonable. A wave of suicides in his capital would have been catastrophic for civic morale and political stability. The families of the deceased would have blamed the government for allowing such teaching. Other cities might have mocked Alexandria as a place where philosophy killed people rather than enlightening them. From a purely pragmatic standpoint, banning Hegesias made sense, even if it violated principles about intellectual freedom. The ban also reveals something about how philosophy functioned in the ancient world. It wasn't purely academic. Philosophers didn't just publish papers for other specialists. They taught in public spaces. They gave lectures to mixed audiences. Their ideas reached ordinary citizens who might lack the philosophical training to evaluate complex arguments critically. In this context, a persuasive speaker making compelling cases for pessimistic conclusions could genuinely influence behaviour in ways that modern academic philosophy typically doesn't. This accessibility cut both ways. It meant philosophy could shape culture and politics directly, but it also meant philosophers bore responsibility for their teaching's practical effects. If your arguments convinced people to kill themselves, you couldn't hide behind claims of pure theoretical inquiry. The consequences were immediate and visible. Ptolemy's banishment was essentially holding Hegesias accountable for those consequences. We don't know how Hegesias responded to his expulsion. Did he accept it as inevitable? Did he feel persecuted? Did he modify his teachings? The sources are silent. He disappears from the historical record after leaving Alexandria. Some scholars speculate he returned to Cyrene. Others suggest he continued teaching elsewhere in the Greek world, perhaps in cities where authorities were less concerned about his message. But we have no confirmed information about his later life or death. What survived was his reputation. Death persuader became his defining epithet, overshadowing everything else about his philosophy. This is unfortunate in some ways because it reduces a complex thinker to a single dramatic incident. Hegesias wasn't simply advocating suicide. His arguments were more nuanced. He claimed that for the wise person, life and death are matters of indifference. Neither is inherently better than the other. This is quite different from saying death is always preferable. The distinction matters. Hegesias argued that happiness, understood as stable well-being, is impossible. Life contains unavoidable suffering. Pleasure is fleeting. Fortune is unpredictable. Given these facts, the sage should aim not for happiness but for minimizing pain. In this framework, continuing to live or choosing to die become equally valid options. Neither choice is mandated by reason. The sage evaluates circumstances and decides accordingly without illusions about achieving lasting satisfaction either way. This position is pessimistic, but not necessarily suicidal. It's a kind of philosophical neutrality about existence. Compare it to Stoicism, which taught that life should be preserved unless circumstances make virtue impossible, or Epicureanism, which maintained that pleasure, properly understood, makes life worth living. Hegesias rejected both positions. He denied that virtue alone suffices for a good life, contra the Stoics. He denied that pleasure can provide lasting satisfaction, contra the Epicureans. What remains is a kind of resigned endurance, or, if one prefers, a voluntary exit. Both are acceptable. The problem is that when you present such arguments publicly to audiences experiencing genuine suffering, many will hear only the permission to exit. If a respected philosopher teaches that death is no worse than life, people struggling with poverty, disease, or despair have philosophical justification for ending their pain. They're not being irrational or cowardly. They're following logic to its conclusion. This is precisely what happened in Alexandria, and precisely why Ptolemy intervened. The episode raises questions about philosophy's relationship to rhetoric. Hegesias wasn't just making abstract arguments. He was apparently a compelling speaker who could move audiences emotionally. The ancient sources describe his work as containing gloomy descriptions of human misery that were overpowering. This suggests rhetorical skill, not just logical reasoning. He painted pictures of suffering that resonated with listeners' lived experience. He made abstract arguments feel concrete and personal. This rhetorical dimension complicates assessment of his philosophy. Were people convinced by the logic of his arguments or by the emotional impact of his presentation? If the latter, does that undermine his philosophical credibility? Ancient philosophy didn't sharply distinguish logic from rhetoric the way modern philosophy often tries to. Persuasion was legitimate. Making arguments compelling through vivid language and emotional appeal wasn't considered cheating, but it does raise questions about whether Hegesias' influence stemmed from philosophical insight or rhetorical manipulation. His contemporary Anacharis took a completely different approach to the same Cyrenaic foundations. Anacharis accepted that pleasure was the only intrinsic good, but he broadened the concept of pleasure to include social bonds, friendship, patriotic duty, family relationships. These, he argued, provided genuine satisfaction. They weren't mere instruments for other ends. Caring for others, being part of a community, serving one's city, these activities brought pleasure in themselves. Therefore, life contained reliable sources of satisfaction beyond fleeting sensual pleasures. This represents a direct rebuttal to Hegesias' pessimism. Both men started from similar premises about pleasure being the only good, but Anaxagoras recognized multiple sources of pleasure, while Hegesias focused narrowly on physical sensations and their inevitable transience. By expanding what counts as pleasure, Anaxagoras avoided the pessimistic conclusions. Life doesn't seem futile if friendship, love, and community involvement provide lasting satisfaction. The split between Hegesias and Anaxagoras illustrates how philosophers working within the same tradition can reach radically different conclusions. They shared epistemological assumptions, they agreed on basic ethical premises, yet they diverged completely on life's value and meaning. This suggests that philosophical disagreements often stem not from logic alone, but from different emphases, different life experiences, different temperaments. Some people naturally focus on suffering. They notice pain more readily than pleasure. Disappointment registers more strongly than satisfaction. For them, Hegesias' pessimism resonates as accurate description of experience. Others are constitutionally optimistic. They find pleasure in simple things. Social bonds feel genuinely fulfilling. For them, Anaxagoras' position seems obviously correct. Both groups can construct philosophical systems, justifying their orientations. But the systems follow from the orientations rather than creating them. This raises uncomfortable questions about philosophy's objectivity. If fundamental philosophical positions reflect temperament and experience rather than pure reasoning, what distinguishes philosophy from sophisticated rationalization? The question has no easy answer. Philosophy claims to transcend individual perspective through rigorous argument. But arguments require premises, and premises must come from somewhere. If they ultimately derive from subjective experience and disposition, philosophy might be less objective than it pretends. Hegesias' third contemporary, Theodorus, took Cyrenaic principles in yet another direction by rejecting the gods entirely. This earned him the epithet, the atheist, equally dramatic as Hegesias' death persuader. Theodorus argued that belief in gods was irrational superstition. The wise person recognized that divine providence was fiction. Conventional religion served political purposes, keeping the masses obedient through fear. But it had no philosophical basis. That two such radical positions emerged from the same school is striking. Pessimism about life's value and atheism about the gods don't necessarily go together, but they share a common root in Cyrenaic epistemology. If we can only know our immediate sense experiences, if we have no access to external reality's true nature, then we can't know whether gods exist. We can't know whether cosmic meaning or purpose exists. We're trapped in our subjective perceptions with no window onto objective truth. From this epistemological starting point, pessimism and atheism become live options. If there's no divine order, no cosmic purpose, no guarantee that virtue leads to happiness, then life might indeed be meaningless suffering, punctuated by fleeting pleasures. This is essentially what Hegesias concluded. Theodorus drew different conclusions about how to respond, but he shared the underlying worldview. The universe is indifferent to human concerns. Meaning must be created rather than discovered. And perhaps it can't be created successfully, leaving only resigned endurance or voluntary exit. These three late Cyrenaics, Hegesias, Anaxagoras, and Theodorus, represent the school's final phase before it dissolved completely. Their divergent interpretations suggest internal contradictions in Cyrenaic philosophy that different thinkers resolved in incompatible ways. The school couldn't maintain coherence across generations. The original Aristippus had taught a kind of joyful hedonism, pursuing pleasure while remaining psychologically free from dependency on any particular pleasure. His grandson refined these ideas, but by the third generation, the tradition fractured. Part of the problem was Epicurus. His philosophical system, developed roughly contemporaneously with these late Cyrenaics, offered a more stable hedonism. Epicurus defined pleasure as absence of pain rather than positive sensation. This made it achievable and sustainable. He emphasized friendship as life's greatest pleasure. He taught that simple pleasures suffice for happiness, excessive desires bring only trouble. The wise person lives modestly, surrounded by friends, free from political ambition and fear. This philosophy was more livable than either Hegesias's pessimism or early Cyrenaic emphasis on intense physical pleasures. It provided practical guidance for achieving satisfaction. It didn't require unusual circumstances or exceptional luck. Any reasonably healthy person with basic resources and good friends could achieve the Epicurean ideal. This accessibility made Epicureanism far more popular than Cyrenaicism. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, the Cyrenaic school was essentially defunct. Epicureanism had absorbed its viable elements while avoiding its pitfalls. The decline of Cyrenaicism and Hegesias's banishment from Alexandria mark the end of one chapter in Greek philosophy's development. The experiment with radical hedonism had been conducted and found wanting. Both the optimistic version, seeking intense pleasures, and the pessimistic version, concluding that pleasure couldn't provide lasting satisfaction, failed to establish themselves as enduring traditions. What survived were more moderate positions: Epicureanism, with its emphasis on simple pleasures and friendship; Stoicism, with its focus on virtue and accepting fate. These schools offered frameworks for living that most people could adopt without being driven to despair. Hegesias didn't disappear into obscurity after his banishment. His ideas continued circulating through philosophical networks, manuscripts passed between schools, and the oral tradition that preserved most ancient philosophy. What's fascinating is how differently his teachings were received depending on the audience and the era. In the immediate aftermath of his exile from Alexandria, other cities in the Hellenistic world apparently welcomed him, at least initially. We know he taught in various locations because later sources reference students who encountered his philosophy in different places. The banishment from Alexandria wasn't a universal prohibition against teaching. It was Ptolemy's local decision, enforceable only within his kingdom's borders. But the damage was done. Once labelled the death persuader, Hegesias carried that reputation everywhere. Other rulers watched what happened in Alexandria and drew their own conclusions. A philosopher whose lectures reportedly inspired suicides was a liability no stable government wanted. The philosophical community's reaction split along predictable lines. Epicureans, already positioned as offering a more balanced hedonism, used Hegesias as a cautionary tale. Look where radical Cyrenaic principles lead when followed to their logical conclusion. This is what happens when you focus exclusively on bodily pleasure without considering long-term well-being. We offer a better path. Stoics dismissed Hegesias entirely. Their philosophy centered on virtue as the only true good, with external circumstances deemed indifferent to happiness. From their perspective, Hegesias had failed to recognize that suffering stems from false judgments about what matters, not from circumstances themselves. A sage properly trained in Stoic principles would remain unperturbed by the very conditions Hegesias found unbearable. The academics, followers of Plato, viewed Hegesias's pessimism as confirming their suspicions about hedonism generally. If you make pleasure the goal of life, you eventually confront the fact that reliable pleasure is unattainable. Better to pursue knowledge of the forms. the eternal truths that transcend the physical world's instability. Yet some thinkers found value in Hegesias' unflinching honesty. He'd looked at the human condition without comforting illusions and reported what he saw. Whether you agreed with his conclusions or not, he'd identified real problems that other philosophers too easily glossed over with optimistic assumptions. The question of whether Hegesias actually advocated suicide remains contested even today. Ancient sources give conflicting accounts. Cicero's testimony, written centuries after Hegesias' death, claims the philosopher actively encouraged voluntary death. But other sources suggest a more nuanced position. Diogenes Laertius, our most comprehensive ancient source on Greek philosophy, quotes Hegesias saying that life is indifferent to the wise person, but advantageous to fools. This distinction is crucial. If you're wise enough to recognize life's fundamental nature, you understand that continuing to live or choosing to die makes no real difference. The sage achieves equanimity regarding existence itself. But for the unwise, those still capable of experiencing fleeting pleasures without recognizing their ultimate futility, life retains some advantage. They can still enjoy moments of sensory gratification, even if those moments don't add up to genuine happiness. This reading makes Hegesias less a straightforward advocate for suicide and more a philosopher describing a state of enlightened indifference. The sage doesn't necessarily choose death, but neither does he particularly value continued existence. He's achieved a kind of freedom through recognizing that the choice itself doesn't matter. Whether this interpretation makes Hegesias' position more or less troubling is debatable. Perhaps it's worse to promote radical indifference toward life than to actively advocate ending it. At least the latter position acknowledges that the choice has significance. The comparison between Hegesias and Buddhist philosophy has intrigued modern scholars, though the connections remain speculative. The timing is theoretically possible. Alexander the Great's conquests had opened routes between the Greek world and India. By Hegesias' era, there were established diplomatic and commercial connections between Hellenistic kingdoms and the Mauryan Empire. King Ashoka's rock inscriptions mention sending Buddhist missionaries to Greek kingdoms. Whether these missionaries reached Cyrene or Alexandria, and whether Hegesias encountered their teachings, we simply don't know. No ancient source suggests Buddhist influence on his thought, but the philosophical parallels are striking. Buddhism's first noble truth declares that life is characterized by dukkha, often translated as suffering, but more accurately rendered as unsatisfactoriness or pervasive dissatisfaction. This matches Hegesias' core insight that happiness remains perpetually out of reach. The differences are equally important. Buddhism offers a path to liberation. The Four Noble Truths don't stop at diagnosing the problem. They identify the cause of suffering in attachment and craving, then prescribe a detailed program for overcoming these through the Eightfold Path. Enlightenment, the cessation of suffering, becomes achievable within this framework. Hegesias offered no comparable path to liberation. His philosophy diagnosed the problem, catalogued life's inevitable miseries, and concluded that death provides the only genuine escape. Where Buddhism teaches that suffering can be transcended through spiritual practice, Hegesias saw suffering as intrinsic to embodied existence, ending only with existence itself. This difference transforms pessimism into different practical orientations. Buddhism's pessimistic diagnosis leads to an optimistic program of transformation. Hegesias' pessimism leads nowhere except acceptance of life's futility or voluntary exit. If there was Buddhist influence on Hegesias, it was partial and misunderstood. He might have encountered the diagnosis without the cure, the problem without the solution. Or perhaps he heard the full teaching, but rejected the possibility of achieving enlightenment, finding Buddhism's promises as illusory as conventional Greek values. Another possibility is independent philosophical development. Human beings across cultures and eras have confronted similar existential questions. That Greek and Indian thinkers reached somewhat similar pessimistic conclusions about ordinary life's unsatisfactory nature doesn't necessarily indicate direct influence. It might reflect common human experiences of suffering, disappointment, and the difficulty of achieving lasting contentment. The fate of Hegesias' writings tells its own story about his reception. The dialogue Apokataron, Death by Starvation, was apparently his only major work. Unlike texts by Plato, Aristotle, or even Epicurus, nothing by Hegesias survived antiquity intact. This wasn't accidental. Philosophical texts survived because institutions valued them enough to preserve them. Schools copied texts they used for teaching. Libraries maintained works considered important. Individual scholars preserved texts they found valuable. Hegesias' work apparently failed all these tests. No school adopted his philosophy as a teaching text. Libraries didn't prioritize preserving it. Scholars cited it occasionally, usually to criticize or mock, but didn't consider it worth comprehensive preservation. What we know about Hegesias comes entirely from quotations and summaries in later authors, none of whom were sympathetic to his position. Cicero mentions him to illustrate philosophy's potential dangers. Diogenes Laertius includes him in his biographical encyclopedia, but treats him as a curiosity, an extreme development of Cyrenaic thought, worth noting primarily for its strangeness. This transmission through hostile sources creates obvious problems for understanding Hegesias' actual position. We're reading him through the lens of critics who had every reason to present his views in the most unfavourable light possible. The systematic catalogue of life's miseries that Cicero describes might have been more nuanced in the original text. The arguments for death's preferability might have contained qualifications or dialectical moves that didn't survive in the summaries. We'll never know. The original text is gone, leaving only these fragments refracted through unsympathetic interpreters. The institutional context of Hegesias' banishment deserves closer examination. Ptolemy II Philadelphus was one of the Hellenistic world's great patrons of learning. He expanded the Library of Alexandria into antiquity's preeminent research institution. He supported scholars, poets, scientists, and mathematicians. His court attracted intellectuals from throughout the Mediterranean. That such a patron of learning felt compelled to banish a philosopher suggests how seriously he took the threat. This wasn't a narrow-minded tyrant suppressing ideas he disliked. This was a sophisticated ruler who valued intellectual inquiry but drew a line at philosophy that demonstrably led to deaths. The decision also reveals anxiety about philosophy's public impact. Greek philosophy had traditionally been a relatively elite pursuit, confined to schools where students studied under masters. But Alexandria was different. It was a cosmopolitan city where ideas circulated more freely, where educated people from various backgrounds encountered philosophical teachings. In this environment, a philosophy arguing for life's worthlessness could reach beyond the controlled setting of a philosophical school. It could influence people who lacked the training to properly contextualize the arguments, who might take extreme conclusions at face value without understanding the dialectical framework. Ptolemy's banishment of Hegesias represents one of history's earliest cases of philosophical censorship, but it wasn't the last. Later Roman emperors would ban philosophers they considered politically dangerous. Christian authorities would suppress pagan philosophical schools. Medieval inquisitions would prosecute heretical ideas. The Enlightenment would celebrate reason while imprisoning materialist thinkers. What made ideas dangerous varied across these contexts. Sometimes it was political content, sometimes theological implications, sometimes, as with Hegesias, perceived threats to public safety. But the pattern persists of authorities confronting philosophy that challenges fundamental assumptions or appears to threaten social stability. Hegesias' case is particularly interesting because the threat was existential rather than political. He wasn't advocating revolution or challenging Ptolemy's authority. He was questioning whether life itself was worth living, a far more fundamental challenge to any social order. No government can tolerate widespread acceptance of that position. Social cooperation, economic activity, military service, all the functions necessary for a state's survival require that people value continued existence. A philosophy teaching that death is preferable to life undermines the basic motivations that keep society functioning. From this perspective, Ptolemy's action was rational self-preservation. He couldn't allow teachings that might inspire mass suicide, or even just widespread apathy and disengagement. Whether Hegesias intended these effects or not, the reported consequences demanded response. Yet the banishment also reveals the limits of censorship's effectiveness. Banning Hegesias from Alexandria didn't erase his ideas. It likely made them more intriguing, gave them the allure of forbidden knowledge. Students who might have ignored his teachings became curious. What was so dangerous that Ptolemy felt compelled to intervene? The manuscripts circulated despite the ban. Philosophers continued discussing his arguments, if only to refute them. The attempt to suppress Hegesias' influence probably enhanced it in certain circles, transforming him from one obscure Cyrenaic among many into a notorious figure whose very name evoked radical pessimism. This pattern repeats throughout intellectual history. Banned books become bestsellers, suppressed ideas spread through underground networks, martyred thinkers gain followings they might never have attracted without persecution. Authorities' attempt to contain dangerous thoughts often backfires, advertising rather than eliminating them. The comparison with later philosophical pessimists highlights both continuities and differences. Schopenhauer in the 19th century developed a systematic pessimistic philosophy that resembles Hegesias's in some ways. Life is suffering. Desire creates perpetual dissatisfaction. Existence is fundamentally painful. These themes echo across 2 millennia, but Schopenhauer offered aesthetic contemplation and ascetic denial of the will as responses to life's suffering. He didn't advocate suicide, arguing that self-destruction was actually an affirmation of the will rather than its negation. The proper response was resignation, acceptance, and withdrawal from desire. Schopenhauer also had Kant's philosophical framework, Indian philosophy's concepts, and Romantic-era cultural resources that weren't available to Hegesias. His pessimism was more philosophically sophisticated, embedded in a comprehensive metaphysical system. Hegesias worked with the more limited conceptual tools of Cyrenaic hedonism. He couldn't appeal to Kant's phenomenal/noumenal distinction or Buddhist concepts of enlightenment. He had only the Cyrenaic framework of pleasure as the good and the empiricist epistemology limiting knowledge to immediate sense experiences. Within those constraints, he pushed the logic as far as it would go and reached conclusions that no one wanted to hear. That his philosophy led to a dead end, both literally and metaphorically, doesn't mean the questions he raised were invalid. Pleasure-seeking leads to disappointment. External circumstances don't guarantee happiness. Fortune frustrates our plans. The body suffers. The mind sympathizes with bodily pain. These observations remain true even if we reject Hegesias's pessimistic conclusions. What he lacked was a framework for transcending these limitations. He saw the problem clearly, but had no solution except resignation or voluntary exit. Other philosophies offered more: Stoic indifference to externals, Epicurean friendship and simple pleasures, Buddhist enlightenment, Christian salvation. Hegesias stands as philosophy's dead end, the point where one particular path of reasoning leads nowhere livable. His importance lies not in his positive contributions, but in what he demonstrated about hedonism's limitations when pursued without modifications or qualifications. The school's dissolution after Hegesias reveals something deeper about philosophy's relationship to livability. 3 students of the Cyrenaic tradition reached wildly different conclusions from identical premises. Theodorus the atheist rejected gods and traditional morality. Annicaris emphasized friendship and social bonds. Hegesias preached pessimism. Same foundation, 3 incompatible buildings. This wasn't accidental. The Cyrenaic epistemology contained a fatal instability. If we can only know our immediate sense experiences, if the external world remains forever inaccessible to certain knowledge, then no objective ethics can be established. Each philosopher filled that void differently, based on temperament and experience rather than philosophical necessity. Epicurus recognized this weakness. His rival school emerged precisely when the Cyrenaics were fragmenting. He kept hedonism but rebuilt its foundations. Pleasure remained the good, but he redefined it as absence of pain rather than positive sensation. He emphasized friendship as intrinsically valuable, not merely instrumental. He advocated simple living and intellectual community. Most importantly, he offered a stable, livable philosophy that didn't lead to suicide or existential despair. By the mid-3rd century BCE, Epicureanism had essentially replaced Cyrenaicism, not because Epicurus refuted Cyrenaic arguments philosophically, but because his system worked better in practice. People could actually live as Epicureans. Following Hegesias's philosophy to its logical conclusion meant not living at all, yet Hegesias wasn't entirely wrong. His observations about suffering remain valid. Bodies do experience pain. Fortune does frustrate plans. External circumstances don't guarantee happiness. These aren't philosophical errors. They're accurate descriptions of human existence that other schools had to address. The Stoics responded by developing elaborate theories about how virtue alone suffices for happiness, how the sage remains content even while being tortured. This solution had its own problems, creating an impossible ideal that no actual human could achieve. But at least it didn't encourage suicide. Buddhism, if Hegesias somehow encountered its ideas, offered genuine liberation from suffering through enlightenment. Not by denying suffering's existence, but by eliminating its causes through spiritual transformation. Whether the historical Hegesias knew anything about Buddhism remains disputed. The chronology works. Magus of Cyrene appears in Ashoka's inscriptions, proving contact between Greek kingdoms and the Mauryan Empire. Buddhist missionaries could have reached Alexandria. Ideas could have filtered through multiple intermediaries, but the similarities might be superficial. Buddhism's first noble truth states that life involves suffering. Yes, but the remaining 3 noble truths offer diagnosis and cure. Suffering comes from attachment and craving. These can be overcome through the eightfold path. Enlightenment brings liberation. The framework is ultimately optimistic about human potential for transcendence. Hegesias offered no such hope. His pessimism was absolute and terminal. Suffering was inevitable. Nothing could be done except endure or exit. The contrast reveals what separates destructive pessimism from productive recognition of suffering's reality. The question of whether Hegesias actually advocated suicide remains genuinely unclear despite centuries of interpretation. Ancient sources present contradictory testimony. Cicero emphasizes the suicide epidemic and calls him death persuader, but other sources, particularly Diogenes Laertius, suggest a more nuanced position. For the wise, life and death are matters of indifference. Neither is preferable. The sage recognizes that continuing to live or choosing to die are equivalent options without inherent value difference. This raises an interesting philosophical puzzle. If something is truly indifferent, why would you actively choose it? Indifference suggests passive acceptance rather than active pursuit. Perhaps Hegesias argued that death was no worse than life, rather than positively better. The distinction matters. Saying death isn't terrible differs from saying you should die. Modern scholarship increasingly emphasizes this subtlety. Hegesias wasn't necessarily a suicide cult leader. He was a philosopher exploring hedonism's darkest implications with rigorous honesty. The fact that some listeners drew the ultimate conclusion doesn't mean he explicitly prescribed it. But this defense only goes so far. A teacher bears some responsibility for foreseeable consequences of their teachings, especially when those consequences include multiple deaths. Hegesias must have recognized how his arguments were being received. He could have modified his presentation or added explicit caveats against suicide. Instead, he apparently continued teaching in the same way until Ptolemy intervened. The modern reception of Hegesias has been sparse but revealing. He appears primarily as a historical curiosity, the philosopher who went too far. Few contemporary thinkers claim him as an influence. Even pessimistic philosophers typically distance themselves from him, acknowledging his observations while rejecting his conclusions. Walter Pater, in the 19th century, attempted to revive Cyrenaic hedonism as an aesthetic philosophy. His famous conclusion to the Renaissance advocated burning with a hard, gem-like flame, experiencing each moment intensely before death's inevitable arrival. This new Cyrenaicism emphasized art appreciation and sensory refinement rather than simple pleasure-seeking, but Pater carefully avoided Hegesias's nihilistic implications, focusing instead on earlier Cyrenaic optimism about pleasure's possibility. The 20th century's existentialists grappled with similar themes: absurdity, meaninglessness, death's inevitability. But they reached different conclusions. Camus argued that we must imagine Sisyphus happy despite eternal futile labour. Sartre insisted that existence precedes essence, that we create meaning through authentic choices. Even existentialism's darkest moments retained faith in human agency and the possibility of meaningful existence. Hegesias allowed no such escape. He was more honest about pessimism's implications than those who came after. If happiness is truly impossible, if suffering is genuinely unavoidable, if external circumstances cannot improve our condition, then continued existence becomes difficult to justify. Later philosophers who shared his pessimistic observations typically added qualifications or solutions that Hegesias lacked. He was pessimism without mitigation, hedonism pursued to its self-destructive endpoint. The psychological question remains: what led Hegesias to such dark conclusions? We know almost nothing about his personal life. Did he suffer unusual hardships, experience profound disappointments, witness tragedies that shaped his worldview? Or was he simply an exceptionally clear thinker who followed Cyrenaic premises wherever they led without flinching? The evidence suggests the latter. His arguments are systematic and logical, rather than emotional or experiential. He didn't claim special suffering justified his pessimism. He argued that any honest examination of human existence revealed its fundamental misery. This wasn't personal trauma speaking. It was philosophical analysis, reaching uncomfortable conclusions. That makes Hegesias more disturbing rather than less. If his pessimism stemmed from unusual suffering, we could dismiss it as unrepresentative. But if it followed logically from careful reflection on ordinary human experience, then his conclusions threaten anyone who thinks seriously about life's nature. Philosophy's history remembers Hegesias primarily as a cautionary tale. Here's what happens when you push certain ideas too far. Here's where radical hedonism leads if you're ruthlessly consistent. Here's the dead end that later philosophers learned to avoid. His value lies in showing what doesn't work, what paths shouldn't be followed, what conclusions create systems incompatible with continued existence. Yet calling him merely a negative example feels inadequate. He asks questions that remain important. Does pleasure justify existence? Can external circumstances provide lasting happiness? What makes life worth continuing? These aren't antiquated concerns from ancient philosophy. They're fundamental questions about human purpose and meaning that each person must answer somehow. Most people answer implicitly through action rather than explicit reasoning. They live because stopping seems worse. They pursue goals because doing nothing feels intolerable. They form relationships because isolation hurts. They don't systematically examine whether happiness is possible or whether life's suffering outweighs its pleasures. They just continue existing, finding whatever satisfactions they can. Hegesias forced explicit confrontation with these usually unexamined assumptions. He made people defend life's value rather than taking it for granted. That some couldn't mount an adequate defense and chose death suggests his arguments touched genuine doubts that many harbor but suppress. The Alexandrian audience that responded so dramatically to his teachings lived in a particular historical moment. The Hellenistic world after Alexander's conquests was cosmopolitan, intellectually sophisticated, but also disorienting. Traditional Greek city-state identity had dissolved. People lived under foreign monarchs in multicultural metropolises. Old certainties about religion, politics, and social order had crumbled. Philosophy attempted to fill the void with systematic life guidance. But philosophy could also amplify anxiety. If happiness is the goal and happiness is impossible, as Hegesias argued, then existence becomes absurd. For people already experiencing cultural dislocation and uncertainty, this message proved devastating. They lacked the defense mechanisms that might have protected earlier or later generations. They took philosophical arguments at face value and acted on them. Ptolemy's banishment solved the immediate crisis but couldn't address the underlying problem. Hegesias had revealed something true about hedonism's logical limits. Other philosophers had to either reject hedonism entirely or modify it sufficiently to avoid his conclusions. They couldn't simply ignore him. The fact that Cyrenaism collapsed within decades of Hegesias suggests his philosophy represented the school's reductio ad absurdum. You cannot build a sustainable ethical system on pure hedonism combined with skepticism about the external world. The position contains internal contradictions that eventually surface. Hegesias simply surfaced them faster than others might have. His philosophical legacy is thus primarily negative, but importantly so. He demonstrated that certain paths lead nowhere livable. He showed what modifications hedonism requires to remain viable. He revealed limitations of focusing exclusively on pleasure without consideration of meaning, purpose, or virtue. Every subsequent hedonistic philosophy implicitly responds to problems Hegesias exposed. The question remains whether modern philosophy has adequately addressed his concerns. Contemporary discussions about happiness, well-being, and life's meaning still struggle with issues Hegesias raised. Positive psychology attempts to identify what makes life worth living. Utilitarian ethics tries to maximize pleasure and minimize suffering across populations. But these approaches typically assume life's value rather than defending it from scratch against a Hegesian skeptic. Perhaps that assumption is necessary. Perhaps philosophy cannot function if it must constantly re-justify existence itself. Perhaps some questions once answered should remain settled so thinking can progress to other problems. But Hegesias stands as a reminder that these foundational questions never completely disappear. They lurk beneath more sophisticated discussions, occasionally resurfacing when circumstances shake our usual certainties. The modern world, with its own anxieties about meaning and purpose, might be more receptive to Hegesian pessimism than we'd like to admit. Rates of depression and suicide suggest many people reach similar conclusions about life's value without reading ancient philosophy. They arrive at pessimism through experience rather than logic, but the destination resembles Hegesias's. What we lack is Hegesias's intellectual honesty about the implications. Modern pessimism typically remains inchoate, a feeling rather than a systematic position. We don't follow it to logical conclusions because doing so seems dangerous. We add caveats and qualifications instinctively. We look for escape routes and mitigation strategies. We refuse to stare directly at the abyss Hegesias mapped. Once fully developed, prove toxic rather than beneficial. Once fully developed, prove toxic rather than illuminating. Hegesias's philosophy might be one of those. Understanding it historically remains valuable. Reviving it practically would be catastrophic. 2,000 years separate us from Hegesias, yet his shadow extends forward. Every philosophy that takes suffering seriously must reckon with his arguments somehow. Every defense of life's value implicitly responds to his pessimism. Every hedonistic system must explain why it won't collapse into the nihilism he exposed. The philosopher banned from Alexandria for causing suicides ended up causing something else entirely. He forced subsequent thinkers to build better frameworks, develop more robust defenses of existence, create philosophical systems that acknowledged suffering without surrendering to it. His negative contribution enabled positive developments he never intended or anticipated. So we remember Hegesias not as a guide but as a warning, not as wisdom to embrace, but as a destination to avoid. Not as the answer, but as the question philosophy must perpetually answer. Why continue existing when suffering is unavoidable and happiness impossible? Every generation must find its own response. Hegesias simply made the question unavoidable, forcing philosophy to justify itself or collapse into silence. The answer philosophy eventually settled on wasn't refutation. You can't disprove pessimism about existence using pure logic, because the question isn't fundamentally logical, it's existential. And existential questions don't have solutions that everyone must accept. They have responses that work for different people in different ways. The Stoics said, virtue is enough. Find meaning in character, in living according to nature, in accepting what you cannot control. Suffering becomes irrelevant when you properly understand what matters. The Epicureans said simple pleasures with good friends in a garden provide satisfaction that Hegesias missed by focusing only on intense physical sensations. Redefine pleasure as absence of pain rather than positive sensation, and suddenly it becomes achievable. The Christians would later say, earthly suffering is temporary and leads to eternal reward. This life isn't meant to be perfect. Its trials prepare souls for something better. Buddhism, whether Hegesias knew of it or not, says suffering comes from attachment and can be transcended through enlightenment. The problem isn't existence itself, but our relationship to it. Each response acknowledges what Hegesias observed. Life contains suffering. Pleasure is fleeting. Fortune is unpredictable. External circumstances don't guarantee happiness, but each finds a way forward that he couldn't or wouldn't see. What they share is refusal to accept that death is equivalent to life in value. They insist existence has worth even when happiness proves elusive. They find meaning in virtue, relationships, spiritual development, or future salvation. They don't require constant pleasure to justify continuing. Hegesias's error, if it was an error, was demanding too much. He wanted sustained happiness, complete fulfillment, permanent satisfaction. When reality couldn't provide these, he concluded existence had no value. But most people don't require perfection to consider life worth living. They accept mixed experiences, find meaning in imperfect relationships, pursue goals knowing they might fail. They live not because existence is wonderful, but because it's what they have. This pragmatic acceptance is what Hegesias's philosophy lacked. He was too rigorous, too logical, too unwilling to accept anything less than what his premises promised. Pleasure is the only good? Then life must provide reliable pleasure, or it's worthless. That syllogism is impeccable and completely unsuited to actual human existence. Philosophy, after Hegesias, learned to build in more flexibility, more acknowledgement that logical consistency matters less than livability. A philosophy that leads to suicide has failed regardless of its argumentative rigor. This isn't anti-intellectualism, it's recognition that philosophy serves life rather than the reverse. The question remains whether we've actually answered Hegesias or simply decided to ignore him. Contemporary discussions about meaning, purpose, and well-being often assume life's value rather than defending it. We talk about maximizing happiness, achieving fulfillment, finding purpose, but we rarely ask the prior question: why bother? What makes any of this worth doing? Perhaps that question, once asked too directly, becomes paralyzing. Perhaps civilization requires that most people never seriously consider whether existence justifies itself. They need to assume life's value and move on to questions about how to live rather than whether to live.